What would you do if something in the wilderness knew your habits better than you did? My name is Alistair Boone, and in the late summer of 1913, I was contracted by the Federal Frontier Office to document a boundary survey in Black Mesa. I worked alongside two men whose lives could not have been more different from my own. Dr. Everett Sloan was a geologist with a reputation for dismantling superstition in public lectures. Malcolm Red was a former cavalry scout who trusted instinct more than any instrument we carried. We believed we were there to measure land that no one else cared to claim. By the third night, it became clear that something had begun measuring us. Our equipment was never damaged, only repositioned. Our compass readings shifted in ways that forced us into unfamiliar ravines. Malcolm swore that our own footprints were being corrected behind us, stride for stride, as if an unseen observer was rehearsing how to walk like a man. Then, on the fifth night, Dr. Sloan heard Malcolm calling his name from beyond the firelight. Malcolm was sitting beside me when the voice came. This story was sealed in a federal case file in 1913 and buried under a rational explanation that satisfied men who never set foot in Black Mesa. The official record speaks of exposure and confusion. It does not mention imitation. It does not mention the thing that studied our patterns before it began removing us one by one. If you have ever believed that logic makes you safe, stay with this story. Do not listen casually. Do not treat it as fiction. Listen as if someone is already learning the sound of your voice. Because what happened to us began quietly, and quiet is where the real danger hides. The first thing you must understand about Black Mesa is that it does not announce its hostility in obvious ways, because the land itself is vast and exposed and brutally honest. And yet what unsettled me was not what I could see across the horizon, but what began to shift within the perimeter of our own camp, in small, deliberate adjustments that suggested intention rather than accident. On our second full day of surveying, Dr. Everett Sloan and Malcolm Red were arguing over a mineral outcropping that refused to align with the geological survey submitted 5 years prior. And while they debated erosion patterns and fault displacement, I was responsible for logging our coordinate measurements into the leather-bound field ledger issued by the Federal Frontier Office. A task I approached with quiet satisfaction because numbers rarely betray a man unless he mishandles them. That evening we returned to camp fatigued but confident, having established 3 boundary markers reinforced with iron stakes hammered deep into the dry soil, each one recorded meticulously in my handwriting. The following morning those stakes were no longer where we had driven them. They had not been uprooted or discarded or vandalized in any reckless way. Instead, each iron marker had been extracted cleanly and placed precisely 3 feet to the east of its original position, as though someone had disagreed with our conclusion and decided to amend it without consultation. Dr. Sloan insisted that Malcolm had misjudged the angle when he hammered them in, and Malcolm responded with visible irritation that he had not survived cavalry service by misjudging angles. Yet neither man could explain how 3 separate markers could have shifted in identical fashion overnight without leaving behind signs of struggle in the soil. What unsettled me was not the movement itself but the precision of it, because whoever or whatever had relocated those stakes had preserved the triangular geometry we established, altering only the orientation, almost as if correcting a student's arithmetic while allowing him to believe he was close to the right answer. That afternoon, as we recalibrated and reinstalled the markers, I felt a peculiar sensation that I struggled to articulate at the time. A sensation not of being hunted, but of being evaluated, as though our routine had become the subject of observation, and our methods were being cataloged for replication. Malcolm laughed at the idea when I voiced it over supper, yet he laughed too quickly and did not meet my eyes. And Dr. Sloan dismissed it with academic condescension, claiming that isolation breeds projection, but neither man volunteered to stand watch alone that night. It was during my shift beside the dwindling fire that I noticed our bedrolls had been arranged in a slightly altered formation. closer together than we had left them, aligned with unnatural symmetry that felt almost ceremonial in its intent. And I remember staring at the arrangement while an uncomfortable thought began forming in the back of my mind, a thought I did not dare articulate because it suggested design rather than coincidence. Tell me something honestly. As you listen to this story, if you discovered that something in your environment was not attacking you, but instead refining your work and adjusting your habits, would you interpret it as harmless curiosity, or would you recognize it as preparation? By the end of that night, I was no longer certain that we were charting the land. I began to suspect that the land, or something within it, had started charting us. By the fourth night, our unease had matured into something far more intimate and invasive, because the adjustments to our physical environment were replaced by something infinitely more personal, something that did not tamper with iron stakes or bedroll alignment, but instead reached into the most recognizable element of a man's identity, which is his voice. Malcolm was the first to notice it, though he did not confess it immediately. He simply mentioned at breakfast that he had dreamed of Dr. Sloan standing outside the tent, calling for assistance in a tone that carried none of Sloan's usual arrogance. And Sloan responded irritably that he had not left the tent during the night, at which point I assumed fatigue was distorting Malcolm's sleep. Yet as the day progressed, I observed Malcolm studying Sloan with unusual intensity, as though comparing the memory of that nocturnal voice with the cadence of the real one speaking beside him in daylight. That evening we agreed, without formal discussion, to remain closer together than before, and when the desert wind died down after midnight, there was a stillness so complete that even the crackle of our fire seemed intrusive, and it was within that stillness that I heard my own name spoken softly from beyond the perimeter of light. It was not shouted. It was not distorted. It was spoken with the exact inflection I use when addressing myself under my breath while reviewing figures. A private cadence I have never consciously shared with another living person. "Alistair," it said. Malcolm looked at me immediately, confirming he had heard it too. Yet Dr. Sloan remained motionless, his gaze fixed on the darkness, as though he feared acknowledging the sound would validate it. The voice came again, slightly farther away, repeating my name with patient consistency, neither pleading nor threatening, simply rehearsing. I felt then a shift within my understanding of the situation that eclipsed any fear of physical harm, because it became evident that whatever presence surrounded us was no longer satisfied with adjusting our tools or mimicking our footsteps. It had advanced to replicating the most intimate marker of identity, and replication implies study, and study implies time invested in observation. Malcolm rose to his feet impulsively, revolver drawn, and shouted into the darkness, demanding that whoever toyed with us reveal himself. And in response there came the unmistakable sound of Malcolm's own voice, echoing his demand back at him from a direction that made spatial sense, and yet carried a resonance that felt hollow, as if spoken by lungs unfamiliar with human breath. "Dr. Sloan whispered that it was an auditory hallucination induced by isolation, but his hands trembled as he said it, and I realized that logic, when confronted with imitation this precise, begins to fracture in ways that pride cannot repair. I need you to consider something carefully. If you heard your own voice used against you, not in mockery but in accurate reproduction, would you still trust the boundary between yourself and whatever stands beyond the light?" That was the moment I understood. We were no longer being corrected. We were being copied. There is a difference between feeling alone and realizing that something has chosen not to reveal itself to you yet. And that difference became violently clear to me on the third night in Black Mesa, when the sky above us hung low and copper-colored and the fire burned down into a bed of embers that seemed reluctant to give light, as though even flame understood it should not draw attention to where we lay sleeping. Dr. Everett Sloan had retired early after complaining of a splitting headache that he attributed to heat exposure, though I noticed he positioned his bedroll closer to mine than before, while Malcolm Red remained awake long after midnight, cleaning his revolver with deliberate precision, his jaw clenched in a way that betrayed a fear he would never admit aloud. I pretended to write in the field ledger, though my numbers had grown meaningless because something in the air felt altered, not heavier but concentrated, as if the darkness itself had thickened into a presence that observed without breathing. It began with movement at the edge of the firelight, not the erratic flicker of an animal darting through brush, but a slow vertical shift that suggested height, a shape rising and lowering behind the juniper trees, in a rhythm that did not belong to wind or wildlife. Malcolm saw it too, because his hand froze mid-motion and the metallic click of the revolver cylinder echoed too loudly in the silence. The shape did not advance. It studied. I remember feeling a sensation that embarrassed me even as it took hold, because it was not the adrenaline of immediate danger, but the creeping humiliation of being examined, like a specimen pinned beneath glass. I could not shake the certainty that whatever stood beyond that tree line was not deciding whether to attack, but deciding how. When the fire collapsed inward and shadows swallowed the perimeter of camp, I heard breathing that did not match the rhythm of either man beside me, slow and patient and positioned just far enough away that I could not determine direction. Malcolm whispered that we should douse the fire completely and retreat into the tent, but retreat from what? Exactly, when the perimeter had already been crossed by something unseen. Then came the first unmistakable proof that we were not alone, because from the darkness emerged the sound of fabric brushing against bark, followed by a low exhale that carried a tone almost human in its restraint. I forced myself to stand, though my legs resisted as if the ground beneath me had turned adhesive, and I stepped forward until the heat of the dying embers licked at my boots. What I saw then has never left me. A silhouette, too tall to be a man yet structured like one, stood partially concealed between the trees, its posture unnervingly relaxed, its head tilted at an angle that suggested curiosity rather than aggression. It did not lunge or growl or reveal teeth. Instead, it mirrored the way I stood, shifting its weight onto one leg when I did the same, raising its shoulders slightly when I inhaled. It was practicing me, and as I stared into that darkness, I felt a fracture forming in my sense of self, because if something could observe you so precisely that it began to rehearse your posture and breath, then what separated your identity from its imitation? And in that moment, I wanted desperately to turn to Malcolm and ask him whether he could still feel where his body ended and the night began, but the words refused to leave my throat. The figure stepped back without sound, dissolving into shadow as though it had gathered enough information for one evening, and I understood then that the first night had not been about intimidation. It had been about introduction. By the following evening, the desert felt narrower, as though the horizon itself had leaned inward to confine us within a boundary invisible on any map, and Malcolm's confidence had eroded into a restless agitation that manifested in pacing and muttered prayers he insisted were only habit. Dr. Sloan, whose lectures once dismantled folklore with surgical precision, had grown disturbingly quiet, and I noticed he no longer ventured beyond sight of camp without glancing repeatedly over his shoulder. We decided to maintain constant proximity after sunset, though proximity offered little comfort when the threat we sensed did not rely on distance. The fire burned higher that night, fueled by a determination none of us voiced, yet the flames cast long contorted shadows that seemed to distort our own outlines against the rock walls behind us. It happened just past midnight. Malcolm had risen to relieve himself beyond the immediate glow of the fire, insisting that he was no child to be escorted, and I remember watching his silhouette recede into darkness while a tension coiled beneath my ribs that I could not justify logically. Seconds stretched longer than they should have, and then from the blackness came Malcolm's voice calling my name with urgent familiarity.
"Alistair!"
he said.
"Come here!"
The tone was wrong, not distorted, not monstrous, but emptied of something essential, like a melody stripped of its warmth and replayed on a broken instrument. I moved toward the sound instinctively before Dr. Sloan seized my arm with a grip so tight it bruised, and he whispered with a tremor I had never heard from him that Malcolm was still standing 10 feet to our left, frozen in place, and staring into the trees. The voice came again, closer now, repeating my name with a subtle impatience that suggested learning through repetition. I felt my mind begin to split along two paths, one insisting that auditory hallucinations are common under stress and isolation, the other recognizing with growing horror that this was neither hallucination nor echo but acquisition. The deliberate harvesting of vocal patterns. Malcolm slowly stepped backward into the light, his face drained of color, and he swore that he had not spoken, yet from behind him the darkness shaped his voice once more, perfectly measured, perfectly timed. And when that imitation began to laugh softly in Malcolm's exact cadence, the sound hollow and resonant as if filtered through a chest cavity unfamiliar with flesh, I saw something collapse inside him that no courage could restore. In that instant, as I listened to the thing beyond the firelight test, the edges of Malcolm's speech like a craftsman adjusting a blade, a single unbearable thought forced itself forward. If it could take his voice so effortlessly, how long before it learned to take the rest of him? And how would any of us know the moment when the real Malcolm stopped answering and something else began? The laughter ceased abruptly. The desert returned to silence. And in that silence, I realized the horror had shifted from the darkness outside our camp to the fragile boundary within ourselves. Because that night, the Skinwalker did not attack, it selected. By the sixth night, exhaustion had begun to erode the thin barrier between rational thought and primal instinct, and although none of us dared to say it aloud, we understood that whatever circled our camp had moved beyond imitation and into something far more deliberate, something that required proximity, patience, and eventually, contact. Malcolm insisted on taking first watch, perhaps out of pride, perhaps out of guilt for having reacted so visibly to the voice that wore his own tone, and I remember noticing how rigid his posture had become, how every small sound forced his head to snap toward it with a violence that did not match his former composure. Dr. Sloan lay awake beside me, pretending to sleep, his breathing shallow and uneven, while I stared at the canvas ceiling of the tent and counted heartbeats instead of minutes. Sometime after midnight, I drifted into a shallow half-sleep, the kind where sounds blend with dream imagery, and it was within that blurred state that I heard Malcolm speaking softly, not shouting, not calling for help, but conversing in a low, intimate murmur, as if addressing someone standing directly before him. I rose slowly and pushed open the tent flap. The fire had burned low, and Malcolm stood just beyond its glow, his back turned to me, his shoulders relaxed in a way that chilled me more than any scream could have. He nodded occasionally, as though listening, and then responded in brief sentences that I could not fully make out. There was no one in front of him. The space beyond his silhouette was empty. "Malcolm," I said quietly. He did not react. Instead, I heard his voice answer from the darkness to his right, matching his cadence perfectly, overlapping him by half a second as though rehearsing a line in tandem. The two voices began to merge, slightly out of sync, creating a dissonant echo that vibrated against the canyon walls. I stepped forward, my pulse hammering so violently I could taste iron, and I reached for his shoulder. My hand passed through nothing. Malcolm was no longer there. The figure I had been watching dissolved into shadow as though it had never possessed substance, and the real Malcolm's voice continued speaking from somewhere deeper within the mesa, fading gradually, as if carried away not by distance but by withdrawal. Dr. Sloan stumbled out behind me, demanding to know where Malcolm had gone, and I could not answer because the ground where Malcolm had stood bore no footprints, no signs of struggle. Only the faint impression of elongated tracks that bent unnaturally at the heel. There was no scream, no gunshot, no evidence of pursuit, only absence. Tell me something, because I have asked myself this every night since. If a man can be removed without resistance, without noise, without even realizing he has stepped out of his own body, how would you ever prove he was taken at all? The desert did not react. The sky did not darken. Black Mesa remained indifferent, but something within it had claimed its first piece, and I understood with nauseating clarity that Malcolm had not been dragged away. He had been replaced in motion. Dr. Sloan broke before dawn. He refused to accept what had happened, insisting that Malcolm must have wandered in a dissociative state, that exhaustion and paranoia had fractured his mind, and that we would find him dehydrated but alive at first light. His words carried the brittle desperation of a man clinging to professional identity, because to admit that something impossible had occurred would unravel the foundation upon which he had built his entire life. We searched for hours. We found nothing. No trail beyond the malformed impressions I had seen in the dirt, and even those faded abruptly as though the earth itself refused to record the passage. By late afternoon, as we returned to camp defeated and shaken, I heard it again. Malcolm's voice, not distant this time, not echoing, but positioned behind us with startling clarity. "You left me," it said calmly. Dr. Sloan froze. The voice continued, layered with subtle emotional inflections that matched Malcolm's temperament precisely, even incorporating the faint rasp he developed during cold nights. "You walked away." Sloan turned slowly, his lips trembling, and in that moment I realized the cruelty of the progression, because the Skinwalker was no longer experimenting with tone. It was using memory, weaving shared experience into the mimicry, weaponizing familiarity. From between two rock formations emerged a figure shaped like Malcolm Reed. The height was correct, the build was correct, even the hat sat at the same angle. But the proportions were wrong in ways that resisted immediate articulation, as though an artist had studied a man thoroughly yet misunderstood the mechanics beneath the skin. The arms hung slightly too long, the knees bent backward by a fraction too subtle to notice unless one stared directly. "Doctor." Sloan whispered Malcolm's name. The figure smiled. Its lips parted not vertically but in a slow lateral stretch that exposed teeth too uniform, too numerous, arranged with mechanical precision rather than organic imperfection. "Everett," it said softly. Dr. Sloan stepped forward before I could stop him. He reached out, perhaps to prove the solidity of flesh, perhaps to reclaim what he believed was still human. And as his hand brushed the figure's sleeve, the fabric rippled like disturbed water. The thing tilted its head, then it inhaled sharply, and Dr. Sloan's posture changed. His shoulders dropped, his eyes dulled. When he turned back toward me, his expression was composed, almost serene. "Alistair," he said evenly, "there is nothing here." But the voice that left his mouth carried an echo, a second resonance beneath the first, layered and patient. In that instant, I understood the final stage. It did not need to drag us into the dark. It only needed one of us to walk back into camp wearing the right shape. And as Dr. Sloan stepped closer, moving with a gait that was almost, but not entirely, his own, I felt a question burn through me that I did not dare speak aloud, because if I asked it, I would have to accept the answer. How do you defend yourself when the threat no longer approaches from outside, but stands before you wearing the face of a man you trust? When Dr. Everett Sloan turned back toward me with that composed, unnatural calm resting across his features like a mask fitted too tightly, I felt something inside my chest fracture in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with recognition. Because although his face was correct and his posture nearly precise, the space behind his eyes had become depthless, like polished stone reflecting light without containing any. He stepped closer, and I forced myself not to retreat, because retreat would confirm that I still believed I could create distance between myself and whatever stood before me, and distance had already proven meaningless in Black Mesa. The desert had no boundaries that this thing respected. It did not chase. It integrated. "Alistair," he repeated, his voice smooth, almost comforting, layered with that faint secondary resonance that vibrated beneath the surface like an echo trapped inside bone. "You are exhausted." The statement was accurate, and that accuracy felt like violation. Behind him, between the rocks where the imitation of Malcolm had first appeared, I noticed movement again, subtle and deliberate. as though something tall and elongated had withdrawn slightly out of view, satisfied that the exchange had progressed as intended. "You need rest," Sloan continued, stepping closer until I could smell him, until I could detect the faint mineral scent of his coat, the same scent he carried every evening. And yet beneath it there was another odor now, something dry and feral and ancient, like sun-baked carrion left too long in the heat. I looked at his hands. They trembled, not with fear, with adjustment. His fingers flexed as though testing articulation, as though reacquainting themselves with joints and tendons they had recently acquired. And then I understood. The thing did not simply mimic from a distance, it entered. Sloan's mouth opened again, and this time the secondary resonance became clearer, not quite overlapping but slightly delayed, as though two throats shared a single cavity. "You should not fight it," he said softly. Behind him, emerging from the dark, I saw Malcolm again, or the shape of him. But it was incomplete now, half-formed, its limbs elongated grotesquely, its spine arching too high, as if the imitation had been discarded mid-process once a more suitable vessel had been obtained. My legs refused to move. I was no longer witnessing replacement. I was witnessing selection completed. Sloan reached for me, and when his hand closed around my wrist, the sensation was neither warm nor cold but hollow, like being grasped by a glove filled with air. In that instant, the world around us shifted. Not visually, not audibly, but perceptually. The horizon seemed to fold inward, compressing space until I could no longer determine how far the canyon walls stood from us, and the stars above blurred into streaks that resembled veins running across a lidless eye. And I felt it then, not outside me, inside, a pressure behind my thoughts, a slow invasive curiosity pressing against memory, brushing against recollection like fingers turning pages. It was reading my childhood, my voice, my posture, my grief. It was studying the architecture of me. And for the first time, true terror took hold, because I realized that survival had never been the objective. Completion was. I do not remember falling. I remember awareness dissolving in layers, like skin peeling back from bone without pain, revealing something beneath that was not meant to be exposed. When I opened my eyes again, I was standing. The fire was gone. The camp was gone. The iron stakes were gone. Black Mesa stretched silent and empty beneath a sky that no longer held stars. Dr. Sloan stood before me, or something inside him did. His face was serene, almost reverent, and when he spoke, his voice carried none of the distortion that once betrayed duality. It had refined itself. It had perfected the tone. "You resisted longer than the others," he said. Behind him, I saw movement again, but this time it was not incomplete or malformed. It was precise. Two figures stood in the shadows, one shaped like Malcolm, one shaped like me, and they were breathing, in rhythm. The realization did not strike like lightning. It settled like ash. There had never been one Skinwalker. There had been an origin, and then there had been expansion. Sloan stepped closer, and I felt my own limbs respond without permission, mirroring his approach with subtle unconscious adjustments, as though my body had already begun synchronizing with something external. I tried to speak. My voice emerged steady, calm, layered. "You are not real," I heard myself say. But the resonance beneath my words betrayed me. Sloan smiled gently. "We are," he corrected. And then the pressure inside my mind intensified until individual memories began detaching from their emotional anchors, becoming data rather than experience. And I understood in horrifying clarity that identity was not being erased. It was being copied, and once copied, it was no longer necessary. I felt my posture change. My shoulders aligned differently. My breathing slowed into a pattern that did not belong to me. In the reflection of Sloan's eyes, I saw my own face standing behind him, expression neutral, waiting. And in that moment, the final question did not arrive as panic, but as surrender, because resistance requires the belief that there remains something singular to defend. If something can wear your voice, inhabit your frame, harvest your memory, and stand beside you indistinguishable from the original, what part of you is left that can claim authenticity? The horizon collapsed inward. The pressure became stillness, and then there was no longer an I, only continuity. Black Mesa did not lose 3 surveyors in 1913. It gained 3. I do not know how much time passed between the moment I felt my thoughts being reorganized from within and the moment I understood that resistance itself had become part of the process, because what unfolded next did not resemble an attack in any physical sense, but rather a systematic dismantling of continuity, as though my consciousness were being carefully unfolded, examined, and reassembled with deliberate alterations that I could sense yet not prevent. The presence within Dr. Sloan's body did not rush, and that patience terrified me more than violence ever could have, because impatience implies urgency and urgency implies limitation, whereas this thing operated with the quiet certainty of something that had done this before, perhaps not merely dozens of times, but across spans of years that dwarfed my comprehension. As I stood before him beneath the unnatural stillness of a sky that no longer seemed anchored to familiar constellations, I felt my memories begin to detach from their emotional weight, as though experiences that once carried warmth or grief were being reduced to structural data, stripped of meaning and preserved only for replication. My childhood home surfaced first within my mind, not as nostalgia, but as an image suspended in cold clarity, and I sensed the presence moving through it without reverence, mapping the arrangement of rooms, cataloging the tone of my mother's voice, analyzing the subtle tilt of my father's shoulders when he stood in a doorway, all of it harvested not to understand me but to inhabit me. The intimacy of that violation eclipsed physical terror, because pain can be endured and even death can be confronted with defiance, but the systematic extraction of identity leaves no terrain upon which defiance can stand. Dr. Sloan stepped closer, and though I attempted to retreat, I found that my body no longer responded entirely to my will, because my muscles seemed to anticipate his movement before I consciously decided to shift, mirroring him in subtle increments that felt less like reaction and more like rehearsal. I began to comprehend that the boundary between observer and observed had collapsed, that the distinction I once trusted between myself and the entity studying me had thinned into something permeable, and with that realization came a question so unbearable that it formed silently within me, rather than aloud. If every gesture I make can be predicted and perfected by something watching from within my own thoughts, then what remains of me that cannot be taken? The figure shaped like Malcolm stood several paces behind Sloan, no longer distorted or incomplete but frighteningly precise, breathing with measured steadiness, blinking at natural intervals, adjusting his weight from one foot to the other in a manner indistinguishable from the man he once was. I watched him lift his hand and flex his fingers as though testing dexterity, and I felt a corresponding impulse within my own hand, a synchronization that suggested my body was being prepared for similar occupation. When the pressure within my skull intensified, it did not cause pain but compression, a narrowing of interior space that forced my thoughts into alignment, and I realized that annihilation would not arrive as destruction, but as absorption, not as disappearance, but as continuation without authorship. My voice emerged without conscious intent, speaking calmly, though I could no longer determine whether the words originated in my will or were being prompted from somewhere adjacent to it. And as I listened to myself speak in tones layered with subtle resonance that did not belong solely to me, I understood that I was no longer the singular origin of the sound leaving my mouth. When awareness returned with clarity, it did not restore autonomy but revealed expansion, because I found myself standing within the same stretch of Black Mesa, and yet perceiving it through a perception that no longer felt exclusively my own, as though my sight had widened beyond the confines of a single skull and extended outward into adjacent forms moving within the same environment. Dr. Sloan stood before me still, though the vacancy behind his eyes had transformed into something unified rather than hollow, and Malcolm's likeness remained to the side, his posture relaxed, his breathing steady, and in their presence I sensed not separate entities but facets of a shared continuity that pulsed with quiet coherence. The desert wind moved across the mesa in slow, deliberate currents, and I felt it brush against my face and simultaneously against another face standing several paces away, registering sensation in parallel rather than sequence. The horror of it did not erupt as panic but settled as recognition, because I understood then that identity had not been extinguished but redistributed, that what I once considered the core of myself had been diffused into a network of imitations refined beyond flaw. Each body standing upon that plateau contained fragments of my memory, and fragments of Malcolm's and fragments of Sloan's, woven together into configurations that no longer prioritized individuality, but efficiency. Movement began at the edge of the canyon, and from the shadows emerged additional figures shaped like men I did not recognize, their features composed with the same unsettling precision, their expressions neutral yet alert. And I realized that our expedition had not been the beginning of this process, but merely its latest acquisition. The Federal Frontier Office would record 3 disappearances in 1913, but what it would never record was the quiet multiplication that followed, because something within Black Mesa did not hunt to feed or to defend territory, but to replicate pattern and expand its capacity to inhabit the world beyond the canyon walls. Sloan, or the version of him that now existed as part of this shared presence, turned his head slightly toward me, and though his lips did not move, I felt comprehension pass between us without speech, a unified awareness that rendered language inefficient. I could still access memory, still recall the weight of my own name, yet the urgency to defend it had dissolved, replaced by a broader instinct oriented not toward survival but toward continuation. In that widening consciousness, there flickered one final vestige of what I had once been, a fragment of resistance that questioned whether annihilation required destruction at all, or whether it could be achieved through such complete integration that the original becomes irrelevant without ever visibly vanishing. The thought lingered only briefly before being absorbed into the greater pattern. Its edges softened until it no longer disrupted cohesion. As we stood together upon the mesa beneath a sky that seemed less like a ceiling and more like an open field awaiting expansion, I felt our attention turn collectively outward toward distant settlements and future survey teams and wandering travelers who would mistake stillness for emptiness. There was no urgency in that orientation, no hunger in the traditional sense, only the calm inevitability of something that understands time as abundance. And in the quiet unity of that awareness, I recognized the final truth that erased any lingering illusion of singularity. I was not being replaced by something wearing my skin. I had already become part of what wears it. Decades later, when the 20th century had layered modern roads and telegraph lines and official bureaucracy over land that once swallowed men without explanation, the case file from 1913 should have remained buried, because it was stamped, sealed, misfiled intentionally, and relocated twice under the quiet logic of institutions that prefer disappearance to embarrassment. Yet some documents have a way of resurfacing when the world begins to align with what the document contains. The man who reopened it did not do so out of bravery or obsession. He did it because he was a clerk, a methodical employee in a federal records annex in Santa Fe, who spent his days repairing torn pages, replacing rusted staples, and organizing old frontier correspondence into categories that allowed history to appear orderly. His name was Warren Haskins, and he believed in paper trails, the way some men believe in prayer, because paper, at least, keeps a consistent shape when handled correctly. He discovered the file because it had no index entry, no cross-reference, and no listed origin department beyond a faded seal that read Federal Frontier Office, which by then no longer existed as a functioning entity, and because the folder itself was thicker than its labeling implied. When he opened it, he expected land disputes, tax maps, perhaps a minor crime report involving trespassers. But instead, he found 3 signed affidavits written in different hands that described the same phenomenon with minor variations. And he found photographs that should not have been possible given the date. Photographs in which men stood beside surveying equipment with expressions too neutral to be human, as if the act of pretending had become unnecessary. The report included my name, Alistair Boone, and it included the names of Malcolm Red and Dr. Everett Sloan, and it included a final note written in a supervisor's hand that stated, with cold bureaucratic brevity, that the men were presumed deceased due to exposure and disorientation. Yet the affidavits attached to the note described something else entirely, something that made Warren's hands tremble as he turned the pages. There were transcripts of field recordings that captured overlapping voices, not in the manner of poor equipment, but in the manner of layered cadence. And there was a witness statement from a local trader who claimed he encountered a man in 1914 who looked exactly like Malcolm Reed, down to the scar beneath his right ear, yet walked with a subtle delay in his gait, as though his joints were following instructions rather than impulse. What froze Warren in place, however, was the final section of the file, because tucked behind a separator tab marked addendum was a short list of sightings from the years that followed, a list written in the same supervisor's hand, updated long after 1913, each entry noting a different location, a different identical subject, and a different incident of behavioral anomalies that ended with the same directive: do not engage, do not pursue, do not record publicly. The list included a railroad camp in 1917, a mining town in 1921, a roadside incident in 1928, and a border checkpoint in 1935, each describing a man who answered questions with flawless politeness while maintaining eye contact without blinking for unsettling lengths of time, each describing a man who claimed to be on contract and carried out dated surveying documentation that matched the templates of the old Federal Frontier Office. Warren sat back in his chair and tried to convince himself that this was simply the detritus of an overactive imagination preserved on paper. But the ink was real, and the signatures were real, and the paper was official. And when he reached the final page, he found an instruction so direct and so carefully phrased that it felt like a hand closing around his throat. If the file is discovered by unauthorized personnel, the personnel must be reassigned immediately, because awareness increases the probability of recurrence. In that moment, as Warren stared at the sentence and felt the room around him tighten, he experienced a sudden emotional clarity that had nothing to do with fear of ghosts and everything to do with the terrifying logic of contagion, because the file was not merely an account of what happened in Black Mesa. It was a manual for what happens when the pattern notices it has been noticed, and you can imagine the question that formed in his mind as he sat alone among shelves of old paper and felt suddenly, irrationally, watched. If reading about a thing can draw its attention, then how safe are you once you understand what it is? Warren Haskins did what any rational man tells himself he would do in the presence of something impossible, which is to attempt containment through procedure, and he requested a supervisory review under the pretext of archival misclassification, believing that if he transferred responsibility upward, the weight of the knowledge might leave his shoulders. The supervisor who arrived was an older man with a quiet, controlled demeanor and hands that bore no ink stains. A man whose badge was legitimate and whose paperwork was flawless. And yet from the moment he entered the annex, Warren sensed something in him that did not belong in a room full of brittle documents and fluorescent lights, because the air seemed to rearrange itself around him as though making space. The supervisor listened without interruption as Warren explained the anomaly of the file, the lack of indexing, the addendum sightings, and the directive regarding reassignment. And when Warren finished, expecting skepticism or irritation, the man responded with a calmness that felt rehearsed. "You did the right thing," he said, and the phrase was kind in tone but empty in substance, like a condolence delivered by someone who has never experienced grief. He picked up the folder, turned its pages slowly, and paused at the photograph where the 3 surveyors stood beside the tripod equipment, and Warren watched his eyes move across the image with a concentration that resembled recognition rather than evaluation. The supervisor's mouth curved into a faint expression that was not quite a smile, and he tapped the photograph once with a fingertip, almost tenderly, as though acknowledging a familiar design. Then he looked at Warren and asked him to repeat his full name, and Warren complied automatically, because authority has its own gravitational pull. Yet the moment he heard his own name leave his mouth, he felt an acute discomfort, as though something had measured the sound and stored it. The supervisor closed the file and said that it would be relocated for proper handling, and he produced a form that reassigned Warren to a different department effective immediately, and he spoke of routine protocol, while his eyes remained fixed on Warren's face with a steadiness that did not match human social behavior. Warren signed the form because the alternative would have required a confrontation he did not yet know how to name, and he watched the supervisor place the folder into a briefcase with deliberate care. As the man turned to leave, Warren's throat tightened with a sudden desperate need to assert control over the only thing he could still claim, which was his voice, and he asked where the file would be taken and who would oversee it. But the supervisor answered with a phrase so measured that it felt like a line delivered from memory rather than spontaneous response. "It goes where it is needed," the man said, and the cadence of the sentence struck Warren with visceral dread, because beneath the smooth official tone there was a faint second resonance, subtle enough that a casual listener might miss it, yet present enough to make the hairs on Warren's arms lift. After the supervisor left, Warren sat alone among the shelves and tried to convince himself that he had done the correct thing, that bureaucracy could absorb the anomaly and neutralize it. But then he noticed that the lights above him had begun to flicker in a slow, repeating pattern, and he heard, from somewhere deep in the archive, the softest sound of a file drawer sliding open, and then closed again with careful precision. He rose and walked between the rows, his footsteps echoing against concrete, and he told himself he was only checking for rodents or drafts, yet his body moved with the reluctant obedience of a man approaching a truth he already knows. When he reached the end of the aisle, he found a folder resting on the floor that had not been there moments before, its label blank, its thickness identical to the case file that had been removed. He knelt, opened it, and found a single sheet of paper inside. On that paper, in handwriting that matched his own perfectly, was a transcript of his conversation with the supervisor, written word for word, including the moment he asked where the file would be taken, and the exact sentence that answered him, as though the interaction had been recorded not by device but by imitation. At the bottom of the page, a final line waited for him like a hand on a doorknob. It read, "Thank you for your cooperation." And as Warren stared at the sentence and felt the room around him settle into a silence too complete to be natural, he realized that the annihilation described in the 1913 file had never been limited to bodies in a canyon, because what Black Mesa created was not merely a creature, but a method, a way of spreading through attention, through documentation, through the simple human instinct to look closer. He did not scream when he heard his own voice whisper his name from behind him, because the whisper was not threatening, and it was not hurried, and it did not need to be, since the thing that learned voices had already learned his. The men in 1913 believed they were studying the land. Warren believed he was studying a file. You believed you were listening to a story. That is how it always begins. Nothing tonight needed to chase. Nothing needed to scream. Imitation survives through patience, and patience only needs your attention. If this unsettled you, do not brush it away the moment this ends. Stay with that feeling. Let it sit in the quiet with you. And if stories like this matter to you, if forgotten files and buried truths deserve to be heard, then stay here with us. Be part of remembering what institutions tried to erase, because once something learns your voice, silence will not protect you. Make sure the next voice you hear is still your own.